Oh, people of YouTube, don't you dare be sour. Clap for good mic work commentaries and feel the pow. Yes, it is I, Big E, but more importantly, it is you, the people of YouTube. And if you're looking for the very best wrestling content, you better come to Good Mic Work Commentaries. Yeah, you better watch this channel. You better watch all the videos. You better watch every single one right here at Good Mic Work Commentaries. Do it. Do it now.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Good Mic Work Commentaries back at you with an old school podcast style retro pay-per-view review. Haven't done one of these in a while, and I've missed doing them. And we have got a doozy to talk about today. This is a Patreon-sponsored review courtesy of awesome listener and loyal follower Scott Moss, who generously donated to the channel and requested that I do a review on WCW Wrestle War 1992 that consisted of one of the best, if not the best, War Games match that I've ever seen, and maybe one of the best WCW matches overall that I've ever seen back in 1992. And taking a look at this pay-per-view was a lot of fun because sometimes in my mind I don't give WCW enough credit for having a really strong group of talent there around this time, despite the fact that they recently lost Ric Flair less than a year prior to this event. And this was still a loaded card, and especially when we get to that War Games match, when you see how many WWE Hall of Famers are in that match, it's unbelievable. I don't think I've watched this pay-per-view or seen that War Games match in many, many years. I remember renting this on VHS from the video store back in the day. I did not order this on pay-per-view. I ordered very few WCW pay-per-views back in the day, but I did pick up one or two. This one was not one of them, but I did watch it, and I would probably say it's been maybe 20 years, I think, since I've taken a look at this match, and it's available for us right now on the WWE Network. So if you have not seen Wrestle War 1992, go look it up if you want some old school stuff and something to do and kill time and it's wrestling related during the pandemic. This is a highly recommended pay-per-view by yours truly, and it was such a good nostalgic kind of trip down memory lane for me to remember how much WCW had an effect on pro wrestling. I think back in 92, myself and everyone else looked at WCW as the minor leagues, and they definitely were. They were a distant second to WWE. But when you look at it through 2020 eyes, you find yourself really appreciating what WCW was back then and what they had to offer. And I'll tell you, man, that War Games match was very reminiscent of just a good old school style, gritty NWA match. Even though they had transitioned into WCW, Eric Bischoff was on board, Bill Watts was doing the booking, Ted Turner had bought the company. You still had shades of that old NWA style, and it was still alive and well here in 1992. So this was great. I hope you guys enjoy this review, and let's get into it. WCW Wrestle War 1992 goes down on May 17th, 1992 from the Jacksonville Memorial Coliseum in Jacksonville, Florida. They have the attendance listed for this thing as at about 6,000 fans, which honestly is not bad. I mean, really, that's what you get for SmackDowns and shit these days, maybe even less than that when there is no pandemic, of course. But it was still a pretty impressive audience, and wrestling was still doing pretty good, even though it was beginning its decline, you know, the steroid scandal, and then 94 and 95 and some of those shitty years that both companies had. To see 6,000 people pack in an arena for the number 2 wrestling company in the world is pretty awesome when you go back and look at it here. So a really hot crowd and a fun crowd, and that's the way wrestling was back then. The audience was so much more appreciative, and they were so much more emotionally invested, and that has never been more apparent than in this match. If you go back and watch this pay-per-view, just watch the crowd. Watch the great time that they are all having. Everyone in that building had a fucking blast, and that was one of the things I took away from this show the most, is just the crowd energy and how much I really, really miss wrestling 28 years ago. Another great thing about this event is how many awesome commentators WCW had on their payroll around this time. We basically had two sets of announce teams, one consisting of Tony Schiavone and Eric Bischoff, who welcomed us to the event. They sat up on the podium in the chairs with the crowd in the background, and they would basically be cut to in between matches to help hype up the next match or hype up the next pay-per-view or show a video package or something like that. And Jim Ross and Jesse the Body Ventura were on the call for the play-by-play stuff. So it was very cool how you kind of transition between the two in between matches and in between segments. And it's a part of WCW that I really, really miss. And it was cool to see this. Like I said, this was during the Bill Watts era. Bill Watts was in charge and brought in around this time to run WCW. He did not last long. He would be heading off to WWE just a couple of years after this, but he was fired from WCW due to some racial comments that he made way back in the day. And this is probably one of the earliest examples of cancel culture that we see so much today. Sometimes if some comments or something shitty that someone does or says many years ago gets revealed and comes to light years after the fact, that person finds themselves in a lot of hot water. You know, we've seen that with so many people, even most recently with the Speaking Out movement and guys like Sammy Guevara, who said something horrible on a podcast a couple of years ago and found himself suspended. And probably the most famous example of this would be Hulk Hogan's racially disgusting comments in that sex tape that happened 7 or 8 years prior to them coming to light. And he, of course, was banished from WWE and the Hall of Fame for, 3 years or something? And this was kind of a similar deal here because Bill Watts, I'm not going to repeat what he said because it makes me fucking sick, but if you want to look up the interview that he did and some of the remarks that he made, the racially charged remarks, you can do that on your own because I certainly am not going to repeat these on this channel. But this caught the attention somehow of Hank Aaron, who is a longtime Atlanta Brave legend, and of course with Ted Turner owning WCW, these comments were brought to WCW's attention and they had to let Bill Watts go. So that was all kind of going on during this time, but still, you know, I thought the booking of this pay-per-view and the matches and the excitement overall was really good, and I would do anything just to hit the rewind button on life and go back to this night and actually watch it live because I really, really miss being 15 years old, you know what I mean? But anyway, why don't we start running through the matches here because there were some interesting ones on the undercard prior to the big War Games match, and it opened up with a United States Tag Team title match pitting champions, get this, Greg the Hammer Valentine and Terry Taylor, the tailor-made man, which is what he was going by at that time, taking on the Fabulous Freebirds, Michael Hayes and Jimmy Garvin, who were baby faces around this time. And I was never a big fan of the United States Tag Team titles. I mean, when you look at the U.S. Tag Team title, when you look at that now, in modern times, it's really not that different than what WWE is doing because I've always thought they've had too many belts in that company. And we have two sets, well, actually three if you count NXT, but two sets of tag team titles on the main brands, which I personally feel is way too much, especially for a company that doesn't give a shit about the tag team division. So here in WCW, I almost felt like the same thing. I felt like they were just creating titles. They also had a short-lived 6-man tag team title, I believe, at one time as well. So these were ideas that were never really my favorite in WCW, but it still made the matches pretty interesting, and it gave something for guys to do. This match was loaded with legends, all four of these guys. I mean, veterans in the business, you know, maybe not legends. Maybe I shouldn't use the word legend when talking about Terry Taylor, but definitely a veteran, and definitely four guys that know what they're doing and know how to work. Valentine, last I remembered seeing him, he was in WWE in 91 as a babyface, and then he was gone, so he was now off to WCW. Terry Taylor, and, you know, anybody who wants to compile stats or anything, you guys can look this up for me, but I'd like to know how many times in Terry Taylor's career that he flopped back and forth between WCW and WWE, because he was in WCW or the NWA in the 80s. He came over to WWE as the Red Rooster, went back to WCW, I guess, around this time when he was tailor-made man. He might have come back into WWE for a cup of coffee as terrific Terry Taylor, and then back to WCW, and then later on, when he retired, he switched back and forth between the companies backstage as well. Pretty sure he was in WWE, and then he went to WCW, and then he went to WWE again, and he was there during the Owen Hart death. And when Russo and Ferrara left the company a few months after that, and WWE was forcing their backstage agents and shit to sign contracts, and he said, the hell with that, see you later, and he went to WCW again. So I don't think there's been anybody in history that has bounced between the two companies more than him. I could be wrong about that, but my God, that guy could never make up his mind. But him and Valentine, even though this is 92, even though Valentine is pretty much way past his prime by this point. You could argue that Taylor was as well, and the Freebirds definitely were. This was still a fun match, and I thought Valentine and Taylor made a good-looking team together. Really cool to see the Freebirds come out to Bad Street, USA. My God, love that shit. And it was nice that this was not dubbed, because WWE, I do believe, owns the rights to that song. But one of my biggest gripes with watching WCW pay-per-views on the network is that WWE does not have the rights to a lot of their music library, and probably 60% of the themes in WCW are dubbed over with something shitty, and it's always bothered me. I have most of these pay-per-views in my own private collection, but a lot of times when I'm, making notes for a review, it's just easier to pull it up on the WWE network. So that's one thing that always bothers me, so I was very happy to be able to hear and sing and dance to that song, just like they did at the Hall of Fame. Man, Jimmy Garvin was in some shape back then, too, I'll tell you. But, it was a pretty fun match, and like I said, I'm going to tout the crowd involvement all throughout this review because it was one of the most exciting parts of the show for me and kept my interest through the whole thing. I love Jesse Ventura and commentary because he carried over everything he did in WWE here to WCW. Now, Jesse and JR weren't quite the Jesse and Gorilla or Jesse and Vince McMahon type of chemistry, but I thought they still worked really well together, and classic Jesse Ventura on commentary, constantly annoyed in tag team matches with the babyfaces, quote, cheating or double teaming. He would always bitch about that during tags in the WWE. Both announcers were really putting over the strength of Garvin's DDT, and they kept saying that if anybody gets hit with that, this match is over. So they were almost putting it over in a similar fashion that they did Jake the Snake Roberts. And Jake, I think, was on the verge of showing up too. He wasn't there yet, I don't think, but really close to around this time, Jake would turn up in WCW. I think that might have been near the end of the year. Can't remember. And he, of course, had just dropped that match a couple of months prior to this to The Undertaker at WrestleMania 8, and that was the famous story of him holding up Vince and saying, I want him out of my contract, and Vince gave it to him, so he probably had to work a 90-day no-compete clause or something like that, but he would turn up very, very shortly after this. In the end, though, Jimmy Garvin does, in fact, hit that DDT that the announcers would not shut the fuck up about during the match, hits Terry Taylor with it for the finish. Greg Valentine tries to make the save, but Michael Hayes stops him with a right-hand punch. Valentine goes down, and we've got brand new United States Tag Team Champions, the Fabulous Freebirds, and the crowd went wild. It amazes me back in the day how guys could do that. I mean, there were people back in the 80s and 90s that would be almost equally as successful babyfaces as they were heels. I mean, the Freebirds were hated, man. I mean, fucking hated at times, but they were also one of the most beloved teams in the Southern Territories as babyfaces. Good stuff. Michael Hayes has always been so damn entertaining in his gyrations and his body movements and all of that. We got a taste of everything in this match, and it was fun. Very good match for 1992. Maybe a 17-year-old kid in 2020 won't find it that great, but 43-year-old Greg Morgan does, and it was great to go back and watch this. Next up, we had Pistol Tracy Smothers taking on Johnny B. Bad. Back in these days, was doing the Little Richard gimmick. He wore the makeup. He had the confetti cannon, the flashy attire, and all that shit. And he had custom theme music. This, I wouldn't really call it a throwaway match because, Tracy Smothers, he's very well-traveled, a journeyman. He's been everywhere in every territory, worked the South, worked the NWA, worked Smoky Mountain, worked WWE, worked ECW as one of the full-blooded Italians. He was everywhere in a really, really good hand. But, to me as a kid, he was never really that over. And Johnny B. Bad was kind of a little bit new onto the scene and still trying to make his way. And I don't think he had held gold yet up until this point. He would, but I don't think he was champ or won any titles yet prior to this. But you could tell that he was going to be the one that was really showcased here. Tracy Smothers gave him a good match. Like I said, he's always been a solid worker. Johnny B. Bad hits a, quote, illegal, according to Jesse Ventura, punch to Smothers for the win. So Jesse is a stickler for the rules. He's very mad that Mero used a closed fist to hit Pistol, and he's freaking out. And Johnny B. Bad gets the win, and it's kind of a fun match. Next up, we cut backstage to a fabulous Freebird celebration with Missy Hyatt, and Precious was there. Reminded me of WWE back in the day. A lot of times at pay-per-views, after somebody won a match, they would do a backstage interview with Mean Gene. I always remember the Hart Foundation when they won the titles at SummerSlam in 1990. The backstage promo with Mean Gene when the Legion of Doom showed up. That was great stuff. So kind of reminiscent of that here, and I always really enjoyed when they would do those type of interviews. Oh man, this next match is fun. Get a load of this. Marcus Alexander Bagwell taking on Scotty Flamingo. If you don't know who those guys are, it's Buff Bagwell versus Raven. And this, I think, is such a good example of how the evolution of wrestlers is different than today. Because in a short amount of time, both Bagwell and Flamingo went through multiple transformations. And this was 1992. By the time they both got to 1997, they were well-established stars with a lot of peaks and valleys along the way. They took a lot of turns in their career. You know, Marcus Bagwell was the pretty boy babyface. He tagged up with the Patriot for a short amount of time. I believe they were called, what the hell was their name? The Americans or something, or the Patriots, Stars and Stripes. That's what it was. He was with him as Stars and Stripes, and then he would team with Scotty Riggs for a while. They were the American Males. Again, very awesome theme music. Go look that up if you've never heard it. And Scotty Flamingo, of course, would head over to WWE after this and be Johnny Polo, and then Paul Heyman would get his hands on him and create the Raven character. And he would also go back to WCW in, 97-ish? And he was there in 97 and 98 with Buff Bagwell, who both guys look completely different and completely different characters than what you saw them in this match, in this ring at Wrestle War in 1992. And nowadays, you know, you see guys in the company or in WWE or in the business for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, and they've barely evolved at all. And there you can find so many examples of this in the 90s of guys jumping from WWE to WCW, changing their characters, changing their looks, changing their gimmicks, changing their style even in some cases. And I think this match is just a really good example of that, because neither of these guys come anywhere close to resembling what they do in 1992 later on in their careers. You know what I mean? The match is okay here. You can definitely tell that these guys are young. They're still somewhat cutting their teeth, even though they're both in great shape and, you know, both pretty decent workers. This match was really nothing special. Scotty Flamingo got the win with a handful of tights, which didn't really seem to bother Jesse that much, which is also hilarious. And that was that. But when you look at what these guys' careers went on to be, it's pretty amazing when you go back and watch how they used to be when they first started. And I feel like it's something that we don't see nearly as much of today. You see it a little bit, you know, when you look at Charlotte now in 2020 compared to when she debuted in NXT, she is completely different. She looks different, she wrestles different, has a different attitude, different look, different music, different everything. But, you know, still for the most part, you know, that core character and that core personality is there, and it's not tinkered with that often. It's only a handful of occasions where WWE really takes a right-hand turn with someone and makes, what was his name before being Adam Rose? Leo Kruger, I think it was, right? So anyway, it's just something I thought about when watching this match. Next up, we had a interesting tag team match that was a little clusterfucky, I ain't gonna lie. This was Ron Simmons tagging up with JYD, the Junkyard Dog, taking on Cactus Jack and Mr. Hughes. So a really interesting kind of just mishmash of guys here thrown together. We got a Super Brawl flashback showing how this match was set up. JYD was shown entering the ring from the crowd. He was in the audience with like a white tuxedo on or something. He jumped the barricade and went into the ring to help Ron Simmons, who was getting beat down by Cactus Jack and Abdullah the Butcher. So that kind of set this whole match up. And during the entrances of this, we get Cactus Jack attacking JYD on the stage and throwing him to the floor and brawling with him on the floor. Cactus beats him down, does the famous diving elbow that he would do off the ring apron so many times. He would do that off the ramp, onto the cement, onto the JYD. and seemingly kind of putting him out of action. Right after that, he got back up on the ramp and took a really gnarly backdrop from Ron Simmons. Mick Foley was just absolutely nuts. The officials and referees and doctors, I guess, had to come out and attend to the Junkyard Dog, and he was helped to the back. Now, I can't remember. I didn't look up any of the news sites. I didn't look up the Observer or any dirt sheets that were around at that time to find out why JYD did not compete in this match. I'm guessing that he was either injured or not in ring shape or something like that, because this was 1992, and he was pretty much not in the ring all that often around this time. So maybe he just wasn't able to compete or whatever, and they did the angle here where he was injured and had to be helped to the back. That leaves Ron Simmons in the ring by himself to take on both guys. And then all of a sudden, after Ron Simmons is already fighting off both guys, the match almost morphs without any announcement made to the audience. It almost just morphs into this one-on-one match between Ron Simmons and Mr. Hughes, with Cactus Jack acting as the manager outside of the ring. And what was funny about this is neither Jim Ross or Jesse Ventura had any clue what the hell was going on here. Jesse was like, wait a minute, is this a tag or is it one-on-one? Is Cactus a manager now? And Jim Ross was like, well, I don't know. And Jesse's like, this doesn't make any sense. And Jesse was right. It doesn't make any sense. I just think they should have done a better job of explaining what the hell was going on to the fans here. I think maybe the announcer or the ring announcer should have gotten instruction from the referee. This match will now be one-on-one. They never did any of that, and they just went on with the match and rolled with it, I guess. In the end, Ron Simmons is able to fight off Cactus Jack trying to interfere and hits another, according to Jesse Ventura, quote, illegal knee clip on Mr. Hughes for the win. So Simmons kind of just football tackles Hughes in the knees. He flips over, goes down, and he's able to pin him. And Jesse Ventura, of course, has a huge problem with that. But Ron Simmons looks strong here. Ron Simmons was awesome. As a matter of fact, just about 3 months after this, I think it was in August of 92, Ron Simmons would defeat Vader to become the first ever black heavyweight champion of the world in one of the best moments in wrestling history. So Ron Simmons was really on the rise here. He was super impressive, and just Ron Simmons is just a goddamn treasure. You know what I mean? We got another kickback after that to Tony and Eric, who brought us up to speed on a couple of things, and then we get another kind of throwaway match here, but one that is still somewhat interesting. This was the Super Invader taking on Todd Champion. The Super Invader was being managed by Harley Race, and the Super Invader was actually Hercules Hernandez, who was in the WWE about a year, actually less than that, probably 6 months prior to this. Herc was still in WWE, finishing out his run there. He was there, 7 years. He was there probably from 85 or 86 up until 91 or 92. So yeah, I'd say 6 or 7 years that Herc was in the WWE. Good to see him back with the mask, because back in the day in Crockett Promotions, Hercules worked as the masked assassin too. So he kind of donned the mask again for old time's sake. You could really tell that he was not in the same shape that he was. Still a huge, ridiculously strong man, but well beyond his days here. And Todd Champion, I probably saw twice in my entire life on WCW TV. I have very little memories of him. He almost looked like almost a cross between Surfer Sting and Dan Spivey or something, or maybe a Dominic Dijakovic would be a better example than Spivey. But a real big guy, real impressive guy, but not much in the way in the ring. Super Invader wins with a power bomb-ish type of move. He almost got him up in like dominator position, but then slammed him down, and I guess what would be a power bomb. Jim Ross would probably call it a modified power bomb. Didn't look that great, but it was enough to put Champion down. Invader pinned him, and that was that. We then cut to Jesse and JR, who were at the announce booth, and they're discussing the main event. Jesse has really been playing up the fact that he thinks Sting is coming back too soon. Sting suffered a rib injury at the hands of Vader a short time prior to this. He was your WCW champion at the time of the War Games match, so Jesse thinks that Sting's Squadron is at a huge disadvantage later on because Sting should not be in the ring, according to Jesse anyway. And another kind of strange preliminary match, but again, another interesting one. We had Richard Morton, who was just a ridiculously over babyface, always has been. Man, back in the 80s, the Rock and Roll Express, the way the women would go nuts for those guys and their fucking mullets blew my mind, and Ricky was still over here in 1992. He's still over now. In 2020, he was on Dynamite throwing Canadian destroyers a few months back. This guy will never die. And here he is in the ring taking on Big Josh. Now, Big Josh was Matt Bourne. And just a few months after this, Matt Bourne would head over to WWE to become Doink. And Doink, I know, debuted in 92 because by the time we got to WrestleMania 9 to 93, he had a WrestleMania match against Crush. So I think it was somewhere around Survivor Series that we saw Doink for the first time. So Matt Bourne was wrapping up his business here with WCW as well. I can't remember really what led to him leaving and heading over to WWE. Probably just a lack of concrete contracts and shit like that. He wound up beating Ricky Morton with like an earthquake type of move, which is actually kind of similar to the whoopee cushion that he would use as a finisher as Doink. I think he would come off the top rope doing that. In WWE, here was more of him hitting the ropes and basically just sitting his ass right on the chest of Ricky Morton and getting the pin. So Big Josh looked good here. I've mentioned Matt Bourne a few times throughout the years. Never really been a big fan of him personally. He had some issues and he had some personal demons, and he kind of said some things here and there too that weren't that great. I always found him to be a cheap knockoff of Roddy Piper. I thought he designed and tailored his promo style to be way too much like Piper. I guess I've always just had a stick up my ass about Matt Bourne. I can't explain it. I just do. But that match was that. Next up was a good one. Former tag team partners and tag team championship partners battling for the light heavyweight title. Flying Brian Pillman, taking on Tom Zink, the Z-Man. Now, it's interesting, back in these days in 1992, that these two guys, who would probably be considered pretty decent-sized guys today, were battling for the light heavyweight title. I mean, these guys were probably 220, 225, maybe 230. Thick muscle on both, and they're in there wrestling for what essentially is a cruiserweight title. My God, how times have changed. Now, Tony and Eric Bischoff take us back to a flashback of WCW Saturday Night when they got angry at each other. Zink had challenged, I forgot who he was talking about, but he basically said, I'll put my title on the line, basically looking ahead past the match against Pillman, saying, I'm going to be the light heavyweight champion, so I'll put my belt on the line. And Pillman's like, what do you mean, my title? Don't you think you're forgetting something? You got to wrestle me first, asshole. So they kind of got into it there. It was a fun little flashback. When they were making their entrances, too, this is another funny part of the show. I laughed my ass off. When Tom Zink is making his entrance, he almost looked like he got scared by the pyro, like it spooked him or something, but I think it was legit. Like sometimes they'll do that now with a character, they'll get scared on purpose, but the pyro that went off really seemed to scare Tom Zink. And by the way, rest in peace to Tom Zink, and rest in peace to both of these guys. Zink, I believe, passed away in 2017, and Brian Pillman died 20 years earlier in 1997. And it's a shame. There's a lot of people on the show that we've already talked about. Hercules and Matt Bourne, Junkyard Dog, and some others that are no longer with us here. This was a pretty good match for, I would say, like 1992 standards, because one thing that I've always commended Brian Pillman for is really kind of inventing a lot of the light heavyweight style. He was doing athletic things here that you weren't seeing that much here in the States. You'd get some of it in Mexico, you'd get some of it in Japan, but Brian Pillman had just a different type of athleticism. He was so good and better than Zink. I mean, even more athletic than Tom Zink. And you saw a lot of that here. It was on display. Like I said, really good match for 1992 standards. Brian Pillman wound up retaining by cradling Z-Man up after a missile dropkick, which did not look good. The missile dropkicks today that are delivered by wrestlers are much more refined than they were back in the day. I think one of the best top rope dropkicks I can remember from the 90s would be Owen Hart. He was the only guy that really seemed like he did it with control. And Z-Man came in here off the top rope. He almost looked like a duck that had gotten shot and was like falling to the ground. And he missed by a mile. Pillman sidestepped him and then just rolled him up into a cradle and got the pin and retained his title. So Pillman did not cough up the belt to Tom Zink. And like I said, it was a pretty good match. But you just got to remember in your head, it was 1992. Another really interesting match here. This was a tag team match, and this one was fucking good. It went about 20 minutes. This was for the number one contenders spot for the IWGP title. This was back when WCW kind of had the working relationship with New Japan. They ran several New Japan WCW Super shows. I think they did one in 91 and 92 and maybe even 93. So there were some talent exchanges going on around this time, and the Steiners were heavily involved in that. And the Steiners were also WCW Tag Team Champions for this match, but the belts were not on the line. This was simply for the opportunity to challenge for the IWGP Tag Team titles, and the Steiners would be taking on the legendary Tatsumi Fujinami and Takayuki Iizuka. And this was hard-hitting, very Japan-style, good shit here. Loved seeing the Steiner brothers come out. I love that old look of the Steiners. They were about to head to the WWE as well. They would be there the following year. They would have a WrestleMania 9 match themselves. So I can't remember exactly when they came in, but it was just a few months after this. And this is when, to me, when the Steiners were at their best. I think 91 through like 94 was just peak Steiners. They were so stupidly good. And again, more dubbed over music on the network because Steiners also had a custom WCW theme back in the day. And Jesse Ventura is very patriotic in this match. He says, "This is USA versus Japan because the Steiners are from Detroit. And all of the Japanese auto companies are putting our auto workers out of business and out of a job and shit like that." So Jesse's very upset at the Japanese competitors in this match. And like I said, it was hard-hitting, very Japanese style of match, just strong style, a lot of stiff shots, and all these guys are studs, especially, Steiner was just, a freak even back then. Before he got ridiculous, he was so athletic, but he was also big and strong, and that's just a scary combination for a guy to be. Really early on, Iizuka took a hard shot right to the face. I couldn't tell if he busted just his mouth or maybe even lost some teeth because he got hit real hard, and he was sporting some color there pretty early on that looked hard way. Like I said, this match went about 20 minutes. I'm going to look it up. I think I have it written down, it's 17 and change or whatever. So this was a long match, and it was exciting. Just good tag team wrestling. And hearing Jim Ross calling Steiner Brothers matches, I always loved, especially when, they'd throw their clothesline, Steiner line. And I remember when Jim Ross, his first night in WWE was WrestleMania 9, and I remember him calling that Steiner Brothers match against the Head Shrinkers and thinking to myself that it was cool to hear Jim Ross call a Steiner Brothers match in WWE because he had called so many, but never for this company before. And it was kind of cool to hear him use some of those old WCW calls. Steiner line. Great shit, man. Near the end, it was really fun watching Scott Steiner and Fujinami really engage in some tough fucking brawling. Great stuff. They hit, Fujinami and Iizuka hit a spike pile driver onto Scott Steiner, and he kicks out. Unbelievable. Fujinami then hooks a dragon sleeper onto Scott. Steiner is able to get to the ropes and avoid submission there, so he avoided two really close calls, somehow kicking out of a spike pile driver and avoiding tapping out to the dragon sleeper. In the end, we see Robbie pinning Iizuka with a top rope belly-to-belly suplex for the win, and Pee Wee Anderson was the referee for this. We had Bill Alfonso was a referee for a couple of the previous matches as well. Always loved those WCW referees, and Alfonso would go on to work in WWE. I think he was another guy. They must have had a mass exodus or something, because there's a lot of guys on this show that was in the WWE just, like less than a year after this. But in the end, we get the 3 count, and the Steiners go on to win. Now, I can't remember if they went off and actually won the IWGP titles after this. I don't really remember, and I apologize for not doing the research on that. Maybe one of you guys can let us know in the comments. For all of you fact checkers out there, I'd like to know that myself. But this match being the semi-main event, I liked because it felt like it put importance on the tag team division. You got the WCW Tag Team Champions. Even though the belts weren't on the line, this was touted as a really important match because it was for a title, it was for a championship in another promotion. And I think all that is really cool. Like, looking back, I wish we saw a little bit more of that now. It would be cool if AEW and New Japan can ever work something out once the pandemic goes away. I think there's a little bit of heat there between the companies, but would be so cool if they could bring in Okada or Tanahashi or something like that into AEW. I would mark the fuck out, man. But back in these days, real cool stuff to see here. And like I said, I don't think 15-year-old Greg really appreciated this time for what it was. And this is a good match and fun. And that leaves us with the main event. War Games. It is Sting's Squadron taking on the Dangerous Alliance. And WCW, got to give them credit, too. They were the first ones to do the whole cage lowering thing. They were doing that since the 80s. And WWE would steal that with lowering the Hell in the Cell. And WWE was always building the cages the hard way, the big blue bar cage that all the officials would have to come out and assemble prior to the match. WCW suspended that shit from the ceiling and lowered it down with the effects and the lighting and the music. Very cool stuff here. And they were ahead of the game in that department. And my God, man, the talent in this match. Get a load of these teams here. We had the Dangerous Alliance, pretty much captained by Ravishing Rick Rude, who was the reigning United States champion at this time. Stunning Steve Austin. And I can't remember, you guys got to help me out. This guy, Stunning Steve, did he do anything after this? Did he go to WWE or anything after WCW? I don't really remember. Part of me wants to say he kind of became a star. Don't I remember him on TV, like, drinking beer or something like that? I think he'd lost all his hair, probably just went bald or something, and got depressed and started drinking on TV. I think he did okay after leaving WCW, but still, really cool to see Stunning Steve in his prime here in WCW. Also, we had Arn Anderson on this team, Larry Sabisco, and beautiful Bobby Eaton, who is always just a great anchor, just an excellent hand, and another journeyman, and everybody that I've ever talked to in my life has had nothing but positive things to say about Bobby Eaton and what a class act he is. My buddy Daniel from North Carolina spoke to him today, actually, and asked him if he had ever worked with Bobby Eaton, and he had. He had reffed 2 of his matches and met him a few times, and apparently he's a really good dude. So it's always great to see Bobby because even though he didn't have a great look, he just knew what the hell he was doing in there. So this team was strong, strong, strong. Sting's Squadron didn't consist of any jobbers either. They were captained by Sting, some guy named Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, Nikita Koloff, Barry Windham, and the natural Dustin Rhodes, young Dustin, about 2 years into the biz. Maybe 2.5, maybe 3 around this time. I think the first time he turned up was in 1990 or 91 in WWE or something. So he was a baby at this time, and my God, it was so cool to see him and Barry Windham and all these guys, man. Great shit. Really cool spot, too, in the beginning of the match when all the combatants are lining up outside the cage. And this was before WWE overproduced the shit out of War Games and started locking everybody in a fucking cage on the ramp. This is the way it should be done. Just keep the people out there on the outside of the ring. And to see Paul Heyman there back with that old school phone, his Jim Belushi-looking mullet, and his suit, and he's gathered around his troops over by the door, and he's got like this big spreadsheet or this play sheet. He's almost like a coach, and he's just planning out all this strategy and telling guys where they need to be and what they need to be ready for. Just a great little touch there, and I really, really miss managers like that. And it's nice to see that we are getting some more managers in AEW, and we are getting a little bit of throwbacks from the past with some legends coming in and being in a managerial role, but none were as good as back in the day with Heyman and Jimmy and Bobby and guys like that. These were the days. So they go through all the rules here. We all know the rules for the War Games. 2 guys start, then you flip a coin, and then each team alternates a competitor to enter the ring. And then once everybody's in the ring, WCW back in these days was calling it the Match Beyond. The Match Beyond would start, and it would only end by submission or surrender. That's it. That's the only way you can win. So this started out so hot. Barry Windham and Stunning Steve start out the match, and within, I don't know, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes, probably not even, Steve Austin is busted wide open. Barry Windham cheese grates Austin's forehead on the cage. It was fucking awesome. He's bleeding like crazy, and blood always looks better on guys with blonde hair, in my opinion. The Dangerous Alliance wins the toss. Rick Rude is in for the Dangerous Alliance. That's pretty cool. He comes in to help out Steve Austin. Jesse Ventura praises Austin heavily as well for his work and his toughness in this match. Rude comes in. It's now 2-on-1. Ricky the Dragon Steamboat is in next. And again, my God, Ricky Steamboat and Rick Rude in the company at the same time having matches together. Pass the lotion, you know what I mean? The crowd goes nuts when Steamboat enters. Just so fun seeing him and Rick Rude mix it up because they are 2 of the absolute best in the business, man. And that's right, I forgot. I wanted to mention all of the Hall of Famers in this match. So let me count them here real quick, and let's pause this play-by-play and discuss how many Hall of Famers are actually in this match. For the Dangerous Alliance, we've got Rick Rude, Steve Austin, Larry Zbyszko, and Arn Anderson all in the Hall of Fame. The only one who's not, I believe, is Bobby Eaton, and Medusa is also out there with the Dangerous Alliance as well. She is in the Hall of Fame. As far as Sting's Squadron goes, Sting is in, Steamboat is in, and I think just those two. I don't believe Dustin or Nikita or Barry is. Well, Barry might be as a horseman, right? So we're looking at, 7 Hall of Famers, maybe 8 in this entire match? It's crazy, man. I mean, there was so much talent in this thing. It was great. But anyway, after Steamboat is in the ring, mixing it up with Rude, and we got a 2-on-2. Arn Anderson is next in for the Alliance. He's then followed 3 minutes later by Dustin Rhodes, who is then followed by Zbyszko. During this time, Medusa, who is wearing kind of like an evening gown type of dress, and by the way, she looks fabulous in this match. She starts climbing up to the top of the cage, and it's a good thing that she was wearing what appeared to be some spandex tights underneath her dress, or some Spanx or something, because had she not been wearing anything under there, the entire world would have been treated to Medusa's name and address. So she gets up to the top of the cage. She actually hands Arn Anderson that big giant cell phone, the Zach Morris phone that Paul carried around, and she passes it to him, and he uses it, hitting one of the baby faces with it. Sting, who has not yet entered the match yet, he climbs up to the top of the cage to kind of scare her away. So she retreats and climbs down, and she got the hell out of there. Around this time, you can tell the ring mat here just gets really deeply stained with blood. And because Austin, Dustin Rhodes, and Barry Windham, I believe at this time, are all busted wide open. And this is why it's such a good example of that old, gritty NWA match. Even though WCW was trying to compete more with WWE, be more national, and be more of like a global product, they still had so many characteristics of that old school gritty NWA style, and it was full on display in this match. I mean, my God, when you look at that blood-stained mat, it looked like somebody was killed in there. I mean, crazy. So anyway, back to the entrance, we get Sting in next, followed by Bobby Eaton, and finally followed by Nikita Koloff. He came in last, and Nikita and Sting, Nikita used to be a heel, and Sting and Nikita have had some history together, so they're kind of doing the thing here. It was almost disappointing that Jesse and JR didn't really explain this. Even Jesse kind of wondered why the two were beefing with each other, because Nikita and Sting were kind of staring each other down a couple of times, and they were kind of making it seem like, can you trust Nikita Koloff? And I liked that. I liked that tie-in there, because it reminded me a little bit of the 80s in WWE when Paul Orndorff had come off that really brutal program with Hogan in '86, one of my favorite title feuds of all time, after the big turn, when he was heel against Hogan in WrestleMania 1, turned babyface and tagged with Hogan a lot, and then turned heel on him again, joining the Bobby Heenan family. And then they worked all throughout the country for the title, even did a big match up in the stadium in front of 60,000 people. That might have been Toronto. I actually think that it was. And again, you fact checkers can correct me on that. But after that whole program, you get to Survivor Series in 1987. Orndorff is back to being a babyface again, and now he's on Hulk Hogan's team. And they did talk about that a little bit. They did say, can Hogan trust Orndorff? And I think they should have done a little bit of that, at least from an announcing perspective, in this match. But it was kind of cool that they had that continuity there, and they brought up the past between those guys. They finally get on the same page. They start kicking ass. Around this time, I think it's Rick Rude and Larry Zbyszko. They're trying to mess with the top rope. They're trying to take off the top rope, and they do. They eventually detach it from the ring post. So now you got a rope laying there. You got the cage all busted up and sagging, because this was not like your typical WWE Hell in the Cell that looks like a goddamn Mattel toy. This was thrown together. Even when Sting and Medusa were up on top of the cage, the way it was sagging when they were walking on it, I'd be scared shitless that thing would even hold me if I was up there. So the cage is all kind of bent and saggy and crooked. You got a blood-stained mat. You got a rope fucking missing. You got 3 or 4 guys bleeding in there. This thing was so fun. My God. So eventually they get, like I said, they get the turnbuckle unhooked there. Larry goes to hit one of Sting's guys. I can't remember who. It might have even been Sting himself. He ducks out of the way, and he hits Bobby Eaton in the head with it by accident. Sting grabs a hold of him and hooks an arm bar, one of Jericho's 1004 holds, arm bar, and just hooks him in a standard standing arm bar, not even like an MMA style arm bar, just standing up holding him, like a rest hold, and Bobby Eaton submits. He gives up, and you know what? The crowd popped as if Hogan hit the leg drop on Andre the Giant. Fucking arm bar. Got the crowd that excited. Bobby Eaton submits, he gives up, the baby faces win, the crowd goes insane, and it was just a glorious moment. And, you think about finishes to matches and how creative guys and companies try to get sometimes. They kept this pretty simple. I like the fact that they detached the top rope and everything. That was cool. But after Eaton got hit, I actually think he might have gotten hit in the arm, not in the head. I think he got hit in the shoulder with the turnbuckle, just the metal piece that connects it to the ring post. It almost looks like a big giant wrench or something. And he just hits him right in the shoulder with it, and then Sting hooks the arm bar and Bobby submits. And it was simple, but it was effective, and it was really awesome. In the end, all the heels are mad at Larry Zbyszko, and I think this might have been, based on the ending here, I think this was the beginning of what was probably a babyface turn for him, because I don't honestly remember Zbyszko wrestling in my personal memories beyond this point. I didn't think he was even in the ring past 91 or 92. He would then go on to be an announcer on Monday Nitro. He would be heavily involved in the NWO angle. He had the feud and the pay-per-view match with Scott Hall, which ironically I think was also at a War Games event. And he would maybe, wrestle occasionally, but I don't really remember him very much after the late 80s and stuff. So for him to be involved here was pretty cool, because he's another legend involved, someone with, a deep history and a lot of history, a lot of guys in the NWA and stuff. So it was all just a great match. It was just a really fun and classic example of old school WCW, of old school NWA, how the announcers made you feel, how good Jim Ross was at his job, putting these guys over, especially guys like Barry Windham and Dustin Rhodes and Austin and Rude. Jim Ross really knew how to elevate those guys with his words, I feel, especially like in WCW, and I miss it. I just miss it so much. I'd do anything to turn on TBS at 6:05 and watch WCW Saturday night. I'd give it all up to live it again. But all in all, great match, and if I don't know where I'd rank it in terms of War Games matches. The only one in WCW that I can think of that compared to this was probably the first one that they ever did. It's been a while since I looked at the one they did in 91. I think the match in 91 wasn't that bad either. It had some of the same guys in it. I know Wyndham was in that one. I think Pillman was in it too. But I don't remember anything specific about that one off the top of my head. But this one was fantastic. So you guys let me know if you're a War Games aficionado or if you're a War Games buff. Let me know where this one ranks compared to the other War Games matches, and where does this rank on your all-time WCW matches of all time? For me, it's got to be in the top 20, because it was fun. I can't remember too many more matches, at least from this time period, that were this good, this bloody, this gritty, and this loaded with Hall of Fame talent. Good stuff, man. We sign off with both sets of announced teams and duos having a few words. Tony and Eric hype up Beach Blast, which was going to be their next pay-per-view coming up the month after. They would then kick it to Jim Ross and Jesse Ventura, who would sign off for the evening and thank us for coming, and I liked that as well. Another thing you don't see too much of today, a lot of times pay-per-views go off the air at the end of the main event with the winner celebrating, and you get the little watermark in the corner and they fade to black. Here, all sorts of shit happened after the main event. They kicked it to Tony and Eric, who talked to us for a while. Jesse and Jim Ross gave us a nice recap and thanked everybody for joining. And again, it's just a time that I sorely, sorely miss. So there you go. There is your WCW Wrestle War 1992 in a nutshell. If you guys have anything to add, if you guys have anything to elaborate on, if you were alive around this time and you have a personal memory of this show, I would love to hear it. Chances are you weren't alive at this time. I'm definitely the oldest motherfucker here, but I would love to hear what you guys have to say. And if there's anything I missed or should have touched on in terms of this show. But if you haven't seen it, pull up the WWE Network and watch Wrestle War 92, especially in today's day and age. We're dealing with a pandemic right now. Wrestling ratings are in the shitter, and we have audience-less shows, and we're all just desperate and thirsty for good wrestling. And if you're like me and you're nostalgic and you really enjoy memory lane trips, I promise you, you will enjoy this show. I want to thank you guys very much for listening, and thank you again to Scott Moss for sponsoring this video. Thanks for your support, dude. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope you guys stay tuned in the month of August. I've got a bunch of special reviews and streams planned. One on some of the great Roddy Piper promos and some of the best Piper's pits. I've got a review of the September 18th, 2003 SmackDown that had the Brock Lesnar and Kurt Angle Iron Man match on that, and also a 20th anniversary of SummerSlam 2000, a show that I attended and had really good seats for in Raleigh. So stay tuned for those 3 fun reviews in the month of August, on top of my Saturday weekly Winged Eagles and my Monday Night Raw reviews. So you guys be good. Thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you real soon. Peace.